Boards devote significant attention to CEO succession, yet the succession of the board chair, one of the most influential leadership positions in governance, is often addressed only when a transition becomes imminent. In this discussion with Marie O. Huber, Director and Chair of the Nominating, Governance, and Sustainability Committee of Portland General Electric, we examine why chair succession deserves a more deliberate approach, the qualities that distinguish effective board chairs, and the processes boards can use to identify and prepare future leaders.
Marie, boards invest enormous discipline in CEO succession planning, yet chair succession is often handled informally or reactively. Why do you think boards tend to overlook this transition, and what risks does that create for governance continuity?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. So there's a real paradox at the heart of this board governance question, that boards hold management accountable for succession planning, yet routinely exempt ourselves from the same discipline. And chair succession can fall into this blind spot, usually for three reasons. First is board members can feel a little bit uncomfortable nominating their own leader. And then second is the chair role, unlike the CEO role, often lacks the same external public visibility. So the urgency can feel a tad lower. And then finally, many boards might feel like, oh, the right person is going to emerge. And they equate that with having an actual process. But yet that comfort is illusory. It's not real, because the chair is so critical in setting the cultural tone of the board. The chair manages the CEO relationship, is the main board interface with major institutional investors. And an unplanned transition, nobody wants them, but they do happen for health, maybe crisis, reputational reasons, can destabilize all those super important relationships. So I'd like to offer up maybe three things that boards can think about for chair succession. First is put chair succession on your at least annual NomGov committee agenda. Maybe obvious, but it's just good governance hygiene. Second is ask yourself as a board, do you know if there were an emergency, somehow your chair couldn't act, who is the emergency chair successor? And then finally, make sure you document the succession framework just as you would any other. So the criteria, the process, who would step in on an interim basis if needed.
Interesting. And so the chair role, it requires a different set of skills and serving on as an individual director, right? So what qualities or capabilities should NomGov committees look for when they're identifying potential future board chairs?
You want to have additional capabilities that are harder to develop and might be hard to assess across the boardroom table. And so the first is really relational intelligence. Can this person read a room, effectively and diplomatically manage the CEO relationship? Can this person manage the board and CEO relationship with that right balance of accountability, but also just as importantly, support? And sometimes that needs to be calibrated differently depending upon, are you in regular operating mode? Are you in a crisis? Second is the whole architecture of the succession process and the meeting process. And if you think about, can the chair, in partnership with the CEO and other appropriate leaders, effectively design a productive meeting? Think about a board meeting. You're bringing in all those people. You're taking offline the leadership team. Do you have effective, productive meetings? If the meeting goes a little haywire, gets derailed, can that person get it back on track? And then finally is stakeholders. So it's not just the CEO and the other board members, but it might be being a board spokesperson in conversations with shareholders, with regulators, with elected officials, with proxy advisors, employees, and others. And then there's also that elusive but super important question of, does this person command the voluntary respect of her or his peers? To give that person authority. And that's something that needs to be earned. It can't be assigned.
And so, what does a thoughtful chair succession process actually look like in practice? Should boards be identifying and developing potential chairs years in advance, the way hopefully they do, CEO succession and successors?
Yes, absolutely. And that's an appropriate analogy to CEO succession. Um, and ideally, you have 3 phases and you're thinking about it over multiple months and years with the same sort of intentional, thoughtful process and architecture. And so the first phase you could call an identification phase. Ideally 2, 3 years out, where you have your NomGov committee really candidly take a look at your existing board members and say, which of those has a chair potential? And that is skills and qualities based. That's not about tenure or seniority. That's a data point, but that's not a qualification. Next is development. So you might want to give those with a good chair potential the opportunity to maybe lead ad hoc committees, or if you have a big M&A deal or some governance issue that you need to steward. And then finally is a transition phase. And it's good to have maybe 6 to 12 months, ideally, where the new board chair candidate overlaps with the existing chair. And that involves a really thoughtful existing chair, assuming you don't have a crisis, where the best chairs treat the succession process and transition as a capstone to the career, not a threat. And what's interesting is often poor chair successions don't make the news like CEO successions do, but instead they may never become public, but they surface instead as board CEO tension, maybe tension within the board, dysfunction, and maybe just mediocre governance.
And so, when a board transition occurs, how should directors think about maintaining stability with management, with investors, and other stakeholders while establishing the authority of that new chair at the same time?
Yeah, so there are the 3 critical relationships. There's the chair CEO relationship, there's the relationship within the board, and then there's a relationship the chair has both externally and internally with other stakeholders of the company, including, of course, the shareholders. And so in the chair CEO relationship, really practical things like, what's the operating rhythm of communication? How often, how best do you want to communicate? What's that degree of candor? What kind of handoff is there going to be from the existing chair? And once again, I think that existing chair needs to really make that handoff and not have a long transition. And then that new chair needs to sort of step in right away and seize that authority. Then the chair with the rest of the board. And let's say that chair comes from one of the existing directors. So that chair is stepping into a different role. And even though they've been around the table together, you probably still want to have one-on-ones within your first 60 to 90 days with each director and say, like, what's working well? What could we be doing better? Is there something that isn't being said in the boardroom that should be? And then having that kind of listening tour really builds trust, maybe surfaces issues, and signals to the rest of the board that that chair is ready to step up into that new role and really earn it and earn the trust. And then finally, chair with investors. And it's really important that the chair might need to have one-on-one conversations to listen, that the new chair's qualifications are communicated very clearly, and having that sort of anchor, those sort of anchor conversations really can communicate to the investor base confidence, intentionality, willingness to listen and to be open. And so I think there are three things you want to make sure happens is that you want to have a thoughtful stakeholder communication plan. You want to have that new chair have a first 90 days, maybe framework and plan. And then finally, resist that temptation to have that sort of longer transition, which really doesn't serve anybody or the company well.